Okay, over to you, Tim.
Very good. So, my name's Tim. I'm an addict, alcoholic, Al-Anon. A smaller number of people here today for step 8. I wonder why that would be. The program always thins out at that point. People become much less interested. Step 4 is ever so interesting because you're looking at yourself. Why have we got step 8 and 9 in the first place? Okay, so to dial the whole thing back to why we're even here. Left to my own devices, I create hell. Not just practically for other people and for myself, but even if things are fine, I can snatch defeat from the jaws of victory, even when my life is absolutely the way I've designed it. I'll find so much that's wrong with it. And I know someone that phoned my sponsor's wife. My sponsor's then wife was an AA member, and this was all taking place in Texas. And my friend phoned my sponsor's wife, I won't say the name, and set out this sorry tale. And the wife said, "Sounds like you're getting mighty thirsty there, little missy," which is brilliant. So all of these problems in my life are my alcoholism making me thirsty. If it gets me to view my life in a particular way, a drink will seem the only way out, and then I can drink without feeling guilty. That's what the whole thing is about. I got some really bad news. The bad news is that the only solution I've found to anything is complete surrender of everything I think I know. Going to God, saying, what do I do next? What do I do? I live an hour at a time, sometimes a minute at a time. I can't deal with more than that. And I've got over feeling guilty or embarrassed about that. Because this system appears to work. So I don't care that it's embarrassing. You know, in job interviews, when they say, where do you see yourself in 5 years' time? I'm like, I don't know what I'm having for dinner. What value would the answer to that question have? It's just a catastrophe. So the way to live is to turn my life completely over to God. Trouble is, if you've got a balloon and the balloon is to float up to the sky, which is where it belongs, and it can't if it's tied to the ground. And unmade amends tie me to the ground because what they do is they perpetuate the illusion of guilt. Now, the guilt is not coming from the unmade amends. It's coming from somewhere else. That can be covered a different time under a different heading. But let's just take as our premise, there is guilt which precedes all of that harm. And then all of the harm I've done to others, those are the hooks that guilt gets hooked onto. The evidence that there is something desperately wrong with. And whilst I think I've got evidence, I won't let go of the guilt. I can't unwind back to the beginning. It's what's holding the stage set in place. The unmade amends. Once the stage set and the scenery collapses, you realize it's just a charade. But whilst all the scenery's there, the lighting's there, it all seems real. So I won't have a spiritual awakening if there is one unmade amend. Footnote. There are amends which can't be made directly in the ordinary way because the person is dead, the person can't be found, the person refuses to hear the amend. Well, I got a recent story about that. I should look forward to telling that. Or sometimes one can't make the amend because of the three ideas in step 9, except when to do so would injure them or others. Revealing new information can injure them or others. Compromising my usefulness through the making of the amend can injure them or others. Involving third parties or implicating third parties can injure them or others. So there are situations where I can't make direct amends, but I can make alternative amends, and the willingness is what brings about the freedom. So the little strings which are tying the balloons to the earth are cut through willingness in step 8, as demonstrated by what follow through is possible in step 9. So if there are people I can't make amends to, I can be free. If I can make amends but don't, I can't be, because even if I say I'm willing, I'm clearly not. So to be free to have a spiritual awakening, one must make all of the amends, all of them. That's all of them. Just in case you missed it, that's all of them. A friend of mine says, knocking on the pearly gates of heaven, and you say, can I be let in to the banquet? And God says, absolutely, please come in. Very good. But first, clean up your unfinished business. When you've cleaned up your unfinished business, you can come in. Until then, but I want to come in now. You can't come in yet. House rules. Whilst there is unfinished business. It doesn't mean, by the way, that you have to get everyone in a position where they like you and approve of you. That's not the measure of the completion of steps 8 and 9. I do my part. So that's why step 8 and 9 must be performed. To perform step 9, we must perform step 8. In the original program, which had 6 or 7 steps, these two steps were bundled together as restitution, making restitution to others. Very good. So sometimes people say, well, we don't need, but people put 8 and 9 together in the same way that sometimes we put 6 and 7 together. And you can do that, but I think there is a huge value in separating them out. And the reason is this: sometimes there is incredible resistance to actually making the amend until the nature of the harm has been properly understood. Sometimes people have difficulty looking at it because they're frightened of making the amend. If you say, well, it doesn't matter about the amend, don't worry about that right now. All we're worrying about in step 8 is having a proper, serious look at our behavior and how it affects other people. Don't worry about how to make the amend, if to make the amend. Let's just do the analysis, and people can often do that. So if you park step 9 whilst you're doing step 8, very, very helpful. If you recall from the big book, it will say that we've already made our list of people we've harmed when we took step 4. Almost all of step 4 is introspective. There is a little bit of a look at our behavior. So certain of the questions on page 67, I look at my behavior. Certain of the questions, well, all of the questions in the sex inventory, I'm looking at my behavior. In the fear inventory, not at all. I'm not looking at my behavior at all. The resentment inventory, I'm not looking at my behavior at all. But I'm looking at my behavior in step 4, just in as far as I'm doing it. I'm saying, what did I do? What did I do? We're not looking at the effect on other people. So step 8 does take things a little further. One could simply rush in and just make amends to everyone if they appear on the step 4 as being at the receiving end of one's bad behavior. I found there's a great value in looking very clearly at what was the harm that was caused and was harm caused. And this is for lots of reasons. First of all, to change, although in some ways in step 7 we say to God, here's everything, now show me what to do. It really doesn't hurt to have acquired an understanding in steps 4 through 9 about what is good and what is bad, what is right and what is wrong, what is insane and what is sane, what works and what doesn't work. Knowing that doesn't hurt at all and can be very helpful. Now, this is not a self-knowledge program. Ultimately, it's about being guided blindly by God. But that information is helpful. It is part of the process. So we're doing two things, really. We're acquiring some information which is helpful, which can guide our future conduct. And we're placing ourselves in a position in step 8 to really do a clear, proper step 9. That one of the reasons this is so necessary is because a feeling of guilt is not sufficient to determine whether or not I've harmed someone. Most people's guiltometer is broken. So the little device which measures whether or not we've done harm to others. And the reason is clear. Most people in recovery grew up in households which were affected by alcoholism or addiction or anonism or schizophrenia or something. There's almost always a lot going on under the surface. And part of that, a lot going on, is broken boundaries between people. So the truth is, I am responsible for me, you are responsible for you. The insanity is this: I'm not responsible for me, I'm responsible for you. You're not responsible for you, but you are responsible for me. And guilt is the right and proper response to when I have done something wrong where I was responsible. If your notions of responsibility are all upside down and backwards, your guilt will be upside down and backwards. You will feel guilty because someone else has an expression on their face. You know, when someone walks in the room and they look sad or they look angry and something turns upside down in your stomach. If ever you've seen the Star Wars films, you'll know about the Jedi Knights, I think they're called, and they have these things called Jedi mind tricks. And in recovery, we have Jedi mind tricks, JEDI, justification, explanation, defense, and intentions. Whenever I'm justifying my behavior, explaining my behavior, defending my behavior, or expressing my intentions, and the intentions can be one of two things. I didn't mean to do it. It wasn't my intention to ... Or I'm going to do it right now. I promise I will do the step work this week. I know I haven't done any step work since the Eisenhower regime, but I'm going to do some step work this week. Whenever I'm doing that, I'm covering up my guilt. I'm trying to get other people not to blame me. I'm trying to, you see, then I projected my guilt onto other people, and I see myself as being under attack, and that's what the Jedi mind tricks are about. So there are lots and lots of defenses against seeing the truth. There's the excessive wallowing in guilt about everything. If you feel guilty about everything, it is an excellent defense against the truth, because no one will find the thing you're really guilty for if you're guilty for everything. It's like saying that in Harry Potter, the last Horcrux is somewhere in the British Museum. Well, you're going to spend a long time looking for it then, because there are lots of things in the British Museum which might look like Horcruxes. So guilt is not a great measure for whether or not to make amends. There's got to be a clear analysis of the behavior. And so when I take step 8, I write out a few things. The first thing, what did I actually do? Which is not the result of what I did, the thing that I actually did. I remember my favorite example of this was someone who I was working with many years ago. And it's not an unusual thing that they said. I said, right, so with your mother, what was your action? What did you do? She said, I created an atmosphere. What could that possibly mean? It is an atmosphere or gases. You were concocting gases in your chemical laboratory and releasing the gases into the another one that someone said was, I permitted a toxic relationship to develop. And there are so many problems with that. What is a relationship? What is a toxic relationship? What did that permission look like? And often it will be, when you unpeel those layers, you'll discover very concrete things in the room. I did the dishes very loudly. There we go. To indicate that the other person should be doing the dishes. I slammed doors. I pretended not to hear when she spoke to me. I stared at her, not replying, for 15 seconds and then turned my head away. What exactly did you do? First column. Second column, what should I have done instead? One of the most comical things that happens in step 8 is people will write down hundreds of people that they have known, and they will say, I ghosted the person, I left them, I ditched the relationship, I didn't stay in touch, I didn't call them, I didn't visit them, as though, when mine first step 8 was like that, as though I am the sunshine. And if other people don't have me shining in their lives as the sunshine, then they're going to be suffering so badly. And I had dozens of people, and I thought the harm was I was not in their lives. And someone said to me, buddy, did they call you? No, they weren't. Oh, so it's not like they were contacting you the whole time and you just ignored all of the incoming messages and calls and letters. Bobby literally never called and never wrote. What is the evidence that he wanted interaction with you? None. There is no evidence. You didn't call him. Fine. So that's the action. What should you have done instead? I did the right thing. Again, leaving relationships. This idea that the person you left 15 years ago is still crying into their cornflakes every morning because they no longer get to see your bright, shining face at 7 in the morning. Did they try to get back with you afterwards? No. Could they have? Yes. Did they have your telephone number? Yes. So every day for the last 15 years, they've had your telephone number and decided not to call. They do not want anything to do with you. You did the right thing. Well done. Very good. So now there might have been some upset at the time. So just because someone is upset doesn't mean there is harm. Many years ago, I was teaching, and one year a student didn't appear for lots of the classes, and she wrote her exam, and I marked her exam along with everyone else's, and she failed the exam. And then she failed the resit of the exam, and she was given the option to redo the year one way or another. And she came back. She was late for the first class. She walked in very theatrically 15 minutes into the class. And I can't remember what started the conversation. But she said to me in front of everyone, she said, "You're the reason I'm here." In other words, if I hadn't failed her, she wouldn't have had to return for this second year. And I just said, "No, you're the reason you're here." And I carried on with the class. She was not happy with me. So what did I do? I failed her, causing her to have to retake the year. What should I have done instead? I did the right thing. I should have failed her. Why? Because her script did not come up to the right standard. I did the right thing. She was furious, but I did the right thing. So this is about an examination of not who had negative feelings, either me or the other person, but was what I did right or wrong? And I think, broadly speaking, the notions of right and wrong, there are two elements. There are absolute moral rights and wrongs. So it's pretty universal in most cultures. I'm not an anthropologist, so I can't say anything absolute. But murder is typically wrong. Stealing is typically wrong. Being really mean to people is typically wrong. Not helping people when you could help them is typically wrong. There are other things which are very much a matter of custom. So there are parts of British society where if you're dating someone, it is rightly assumed that you are not currently dating anyone else. And when I say dating, I don't mean dating, I mean something else. You can probably guess what the something else is. And so in one of those social settings, if you don't disclose to the other person that you are dating someone else, at 2 o'clock in the morning on Saturday into Sunday, then you're really going to be harming them because you're exposing them potentially to disease, and they've gone into the interaction with you in good faith. There are other sections of British society where the assumption is, unless you ask, you have to assume anything could be happening behind your back. Certain age groups, let's not go into the specific demographics, but there are bits of British society where it is not a given that if you are dating someone, and I don't mean dating, that they are the only person you're dating. So buyer beware. So what is right or wrong depends very much on the custom of the civilization you're in, the society you're in, the little subsection of society that you're in. Whether someone will feel aggrieved or harmed by your behavior is therefore to do not just with morality, but with custom. What is customary amongst that crowd? How do people normally operate amongst that crowd? And then the hardest bit of this is harm. And people struggle with this enormously. So the first two bits are about me. What did I do and what should I have done instead? The third part is how the other person was hurt or injured. Um, now, what most alcoholics do, addicts, whatever, is absolutely incapable, as was I, of looking at anything from anyone else's point of view. So my alcoholism consists in thinking that I am the only person who really exists. Everyone else is a pale shadow. They're shadow figures cast on the wall by the hands which are moving between the fire and the wall. You know, when people project rabbits or cats or whatever onto a wall when there's a little fire and they use their hands to create the shadows. And it's as though people were no more than those shadows on the wall. And I was the hands which were creating them. This is absolutely standard. So when you get to the third question, how was the person harmed? Very often people can do no more initially than write what they did, but from the other person's perspective. And people will literally write this. I'll give you an example. First column, I didn't call Susie. Second column, what should I have done? Called Susie. Third column, how did the other person suffer? I rejected her. It's still got I at the center of it. The other person is still an object. And it's still only about the behavior. Reject, that is the thing that you did. It's not the thing that the person suffered. So what one's got to do is turn it round and look at the world from the other person's perspective. What did they actually experience versus what would they have experienced if you had behaved right? So this is one of the first exercises in the program of placing oneself in the shoes of the other person. A later point in the program at which this is activated is in step 12. On page 90 of the big book, it goes into this very clearly. It talks in relation to 12th stepping about the idea of putting yourself in the other person's shoes, asking yourself how you would like to be approached if the tables were turned. And this is what we're doing in the third column. So I'm putting, as it were, myself out of the picture and saying, how would I experience life if I were them? And you start with the practical and then you move inwards. And it's very helpful to work with checklists with step 8. And I have some little checklists. They're all, I think, all of this stuff is at the link via the blog. If you go to the blog first 164 blogspot, and then there's step PDFs at the top. Lots, all the materials are there for download at the link. But I'm just going to run through what the basic forms of harm are. The first, and I'm going to start with the easiest ones. Physical injury, very clear. Damage to or theft of property, very clear. Monetary loss, very clear. Deprivation of time. Someone tried to make amends, or they made an approach to make amends to me. And it's for something that might have been big in their mind, but was relatively trivial from my point of view. I can't remember what they looked like, okay? And it was from 12 years ago. So that's how big it is in my consciousness. And I remember the behavior, but I thought it was someone else. So I didn't even know it was that. Anyway, they approached me to make amends. And I thought, okay, it's fine. So, and I wrote back, it was by email. They said, send me a letter. Send me a letter or a note, just a few lines. A line will do. It's fine. This is not a big deal. Just by email. My WhatsApp is this. And then they started to insist, well, no, I want to come in person. And then we entered in, I realized that 7 emails later, there was still no clarity about when exactly they were going to turn up at my home group. And I was going to have to remember somehow in mid-August that they might be descending on my home to overwhelm me with this very dramatic event. And I'd have to make a mental note to let them know if I didn't happen to be at the home group on that day, and then give them sequences of other dates when they could. I thought, oh my God, why why am I doing this? So I said, just look, this is getting really time consuming and inconvenient. So how about if you want to make amends, that's great. Just send me a note. I haven't heard anything since then. That's the end of that, I think. But the point is deprivation of time. The technical term for that is dicking someone around or jerking someone around. I've done a lot of this in my life, taking people's time unnecessarily. The next one's interference in how someone is discharging their duties or in their life generally. Intrusion. Now, people have different notions of what is intrusive. Someone asked me once, what do you find intrusive? And I said, being addressed, being asked questions like that. That's what I find intrusive. Other people are much more open, but people can be very intrusive. You know, when you're at a meeting and someone comes up to you and says, you look so much better than you did last week. Or after a meeting, someone sends you a message saying, are you okay? You look really rough. Very good, well done. This is intrusion. And nuisance. Messing people around, just giving people work to do. Giving people work that they wouldn't otherwise have had to do. A friend of mine tells a very good story about this. When someone said, can you put the chairs away? And he finds a couple of other things to do first. And he goes to put the chairs away, and the chairs have been put away. And he says to the other chap, I said I was going to do that. And the other chap said, you said you were going to do that, but you didn't do it. So I did it because it was on my mind that I kept noticing it hadn't been done. So I just did it. Nuisance. Trivial examples, but it's the nature of the wrong which is of interest here. And what we're interested in, footnote, what we're interested in step 8 is the nature of how I impact other people's lives. The magnitude of the harm is neither here nor there. And in step 8, in the 12 and 12, it's very good. It says, we must examine all of our human relationships because defective human relationships are at the root of all of our problems, including our alcoholism. So it's worthwhile to really look at everything in step 8. Very often people in step 8 will come back having done their step 8. You'll say, how many names have you got? 12, 20, what? Okay, so your behavior has been Christ-like and exemplary in every other human interaction, has it? Great. So if I phoned up all the people who you've ever met who are not in this select group of 12 or 18 or 20, and I asked them, you know, would they describe you as such an exemplary example of human conduct that you should serve as the model for everyone's behavior? You know, it's not the case. It's just not the case. If there aren't scores of people, if not hundreds, you're not doing your job. This is not about self-flagellation. because there's no room for beating oneself up. What there is room for is a clear analysis of what works and what doesn't, what is moral and what is immoral, what is customary and what is not customary, what is good and what is bad, what works and what doesn't work. And if you can't see it, you won't get rid of it, because you won't see that it's there. You won't know that it's there to be gotten rid of. So one can look at an awful lot of situations, an awful lot of people, without feeling anything but joy that finally this is being addressed. And very often, the people that do a really good job in step 8 and really look at everything, once you're looking at the last few dozen situations, you'll often discover that in 3 out of 4 of those, you did very little wrong, sometimes nothing wrong, but you've been carrying guilt, maybe for decades, over things that you needn't have carried guilt over. And it is only by performing a meticulous scientific examination of the rights and the wrongs of those situations that you can be released from the guilt. Often, I had so many general clouds of guilt which hung over whole periods of my life, and I didn't know why. I needed to do step 8 to discover why. And often the amends were very simple. I was a handful at school. I was at a boarding school, so I was a handful for the people that I was living. And I remember one occasion, and this is one of many, where I hacked open my arm in front of people. And when I made amends for that, I approached a number of people, and it was a general amend for placing them in a position of having a ringside seat to someone else's self-destruction, eliciting help which they couldn't provide and I couldn't receive. And there was very little that could be said in response to that. What people said was, they were glad I was doing okay. They were glad I was doing better. But it needed acknowledgement. It wasn't a great big, I'm a terrible person. It was a simple acknowledgement of the effect that I had had on others. Now, I was doing what I was doing because I was very ill, fine, but I still did it and it had an effect. So it's not about beating myself up in front of other people. That's not what steps 8 and 9 are about. It is about acknowledging the effect. And I've heard some very good amends from people who simply acknowledged that the effect that they had had. I had one a couple of days ago when someone called up when we'd had a bit of a sponsorship breakdown. I sponsored them for, I think, 2 or 3 weeks, if that. And it broke down when I challenged them to say about resistance to something. And they said, I'm not resistant, and it all broke down. They phoned me up and they said, you know what, I was resistant. And we had a laugh and it was fine. But it wasn't, I'm a terrible person, I shouldn't have done this and I've affected you so badly. None of that, just an admission of truth. An admission of truth. How have I affected someone else? Other forms of harm, unnecessary emotional suffering. And if you can name the emotions, it's speculative, but have a go. Unnecessary is important here. Some things cause necessary emotional suffering. A breakup of a long relationship will cause emotional suffering. The fact that emotional suffering has been caused does not mean that you shouldn't have broken up. The question is it unnecessary? Harm to relationships with third parties. So if you're talking to Susie and Susie is sponsored by Bobby and you're bad-mouthing Bobby to Susie, it undermines her relationship with her sponsor. Reputational harm. So any bad mouthing at all. So that's the first level of harm, at the point of impact, how the behavior affects something directly. Secondly, there is harm to the relationship. I can think of particular things people have done where in response, I've thought, I don't trust this person anymore, so I'm going to dial back the relationship. I've had this with clients, certain clients who behaved in certain ways. There was one client where the deadline was 5 p.m. and in my industry, the deadline is not passed until the deadline is passed. And so agents, the agencies will never remind you that the job is due or is overdue until, let's say it's 5 o'clock, until after 5 o'clock. They wait to see if you've delivered on time before they say, where's the job? This agency, 4:45, the deadline hasn't even hit. They write to me saying, where's the job? The client is waiting. I'm like, we haven't hit the deadline yet. And I realized I'm dealing with someone here who is irrational and dangerous. And I dialed back the relationship, that client, that agency. I don't work with them unless I really, really have to. One small act, it has a significant effect. And that's happened with me and other people. I've damaged relationships with sponsors by saying inappropriate things. And that's been the end of the relationship. People remember certain things for years. So sometimes the incident is minor, but if it is unamended, it causes a rupture which can go on for decades. The third level is spiritual harm. And now this is extremely speculative. And really with steps 8 and 9, it's important to, I think, make amends only really if there's a sort of level 1 harm, point of impact, level 2 harm, damage to the relationship. It's useful to look at the spiritual harm. It's vanishingly rare that one would actually have to make amends to that, because it would be incredibly patronizing to say, I did so many things for you, I should have left you to learn your life's lessons on your own. You can't. It's so that would be so destructive to say that, because it implies that you're in a very high moral and spiritual position and they're just this sort of creature that was under your control. But some examples of spiritual harm. If you're enmeshed in an enabling situation that's stopping someone from hitting a rock bottom or learning to develop their own resources, you're blocking their development. Now, generally the remedy is just stop it and withdraw. If it's been malevolent or has met significant resistance and you carried on anyway, there might be a harm. But that's something that's worth recognizing. And the same thing the other way around. If one fails to offer help where help is due, misdirection, particularly if you're in a position of power or authority, whether actual or perceived, there is a responsibility there. With power comes responsibility. And anything which increases separation as opposed to unity. So those are 4 things to think about with spiritual harm. So stopping someone from developing because you're doing everything for them, failing to do things for them to help them to develop. So those are 2 sides of the same coin, misdirection and increasing separation. But one mustn't get too haughty about that. People get very I've done it. I've got very conceited about the effect I think I've had on people spiritually, not realizing they have their own higher powers. So that's worth noting as an aside. But the thing is, if there's been bad behavior, there will have been impact very directly, which the other person will be aware of. I'd say only a proportion of step 8s actually result in a step 9. It doesn't mean that if one is examining a step 8 and you realize at some point there is no step 9 due, that you stop the step 8 midstream or cross it out or tear up the piece of paper. Keep it, because you need the evidence for later. If 5 years later you start to feel guilty, well, maybe I harmed that person, you can look back and see the solid work you've done. So all of those step 8s where you decide at the end of the day that you had inappropriate guilt, or very often a very good example of where an amend ultimately isn't owed. I don't know how familiar any of you are with English and Welsh contract law and civil liability and tort and so on, but there's a famous case from around the turn of the 19th into the 20th century. I can't remember the name of the case. If Evan were here, he'd look it up for us, but he's not here, so we'll have to do without. Chap was cycling along a road which ran through a country estate, but through which there was a right of way. So he had the right to cycle along this road through the country estate. And there had been a storm and a branch had fallen on the road. This was at night. And he's cycling along. He hits the branch, flies off it, breaks his arm. And he sues the landowner for failing to maintain this road which ran through his property. And the court awarded in the plaintiff's favor and said, you're quite right. This gentleman who owned the land should have maintained the road in a roadworthy state. You're absolutely right. But I'm going to award you damages. That's the amount that the court awards to the person who is found in favor of the compensation of the damages. We're going to award you damages of 0 pence, nothing. Why? Because of the notion of contributory negligence. You did not have a light on your bicycle. If you had had a light on your bicycle, you would have seen the branch and you wouldn't have hit it. You wouldn't have fallen off it. You wouldn't have broken your arm. So you're right, but you're not getting a penny. Contributory negligence. And there are so many situations where the other person was a willing participant or a co-conspirator. And to the extent that the other person was an adult who knew exactly what they were doing, who knew exactly what they were getting into, who was of sound mind and had full information, you're not responsible for their terrible decisions. And so, yes, there is bad behavior, but the other person was that they signed up for it, that this was the risk that both of you were entering into. A couple of other points. So someone asked in the chat about, I won't read that exactly, but the situation is this. If you do something and it produces a very negative response from someone, you shouldn't have done it. Unless sometimes there are positions of formal authority. So if you're a teacher and you have students, you're going to say things which are going to produce a negative result, but you're right to say them. With unreasonable clients who are, I'm under no obligation with my clients to take on any particular work. It's all very much first come, first served. There's no underlying commitment. Sometimes they get upset because I say no, but what can I do? I've got a limited number of hours I can work per week. If I'm booked, I'm booked. There's nothing I can do about it. But if I piss someone off in a social setting, in most cases, there's something going on beneath the surface. There is a sign that I wasn't aware of. There were signals that I didn't see. Something has gone wrong here. And so whether I've done something right or wrong, I suppose there is a third thing. It's not just what is morally right and wrong, what is customarily right and wrong. It is what is right and wrong for that person. So you can do something with 99 people and it's absolutely fine, but the 100th is a live wire and you mustn't do it. I had a sister who was very unwell in lots of substantial ways, physically and mentally and emotionally. And what I knew about her was if you said you were going to be there at 11 o'clock, you had to be there at 11 o'clock. If you were 1 minute late, she'd start to panic very badly. Being 1 minute late or 5 minutes late with anyone else wouldn't make the slightest bit of difference, particularly when you're meeting at someone's home. I mean, they're at home, they're not being inconvenienced in any way. But she was different because of how she was built. So if I was going to be late, even 1 minute, I would call her on the phone and say, I'm going to be 1 minute late. Don't worry, I'm going to be. So you've got to take into account the individual. A good starting point for step 8 is indeed the negative reactions of others. Just because others have reacted negatively does not mean automatically I've done harm, but it is what we refer to as a smoking gun. So such situations require some examination. And the important thing to consider in the examination is the behavior which triggers the response, the negative response, may not be the real reason they're responding. There is almost, when there's an unexpected negative response from someone, or where the response seems inappropriate, disproportionate, or untimely, they're probably actually responding to a whole pattern of behavior which has gone back days, weeks, months, or years. And now the rivets have popped, and now you're getting the reaction. So the way people react to me is often the delivery of goods that I've been consistently ordering for a very long time. So it's a very common situation when someone behaves badly to think, I didn't do anything wrong, there's nothing here. Look at what I did. It's perfectly innocent. They're just overreacting. Yeah, they're not reacting to the thing that you just did. They're reacting to your whole demeanor, your bearing, your comportment, your behavior, which goes back for years. I made the mistake, terrible mistake of complaining. I did, me, complaining to my sponsor on the phone about the behavior of, as they put it, another member. And I said, I was so spiritual. I said, I'm just going to have to forgive them and let this one go. And he said, oh, no, 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 no. His behavior, his reaction was his defense against your defects of character. What did you do that elicited or activated that behavior in him? I feel so abandoned. What makes you so abandonable? I didn't cause it, create it, I can't control it. Great, fine, step one, Al-Anon. But I can elicit it, I can activate it, I can make it a hell of a lot worse. Their character defect, which existed before I walked in the room, fine. But why did it make an appearance like the alien out of someone's chest in the film Alien? Why did it appear when you walked in the room? Yes, it was in there already, but why did it come out and say hello to you? Because you invited it. What did you do to invite that response? Very interesting line of investigation. Jason, that's all I got. So I'm going to suggest we go straight into questions. Now, we're recording, as Jason said earlier. So if you don't want to be recorded, then post the question in chat, either privately or to everyone if you like, it doesn't really matter. If you'd like to voice a question out loud, then keep it nice and brief. So have a little think before you actually pose it. Does anyone have any questions? If you do, as I say, put it in the chat or raise your virtual Simpsons hand. Kate.
Yeah, thanks. Hi, Tim. I'm Kate. I'm an alcoholic. I just want to go right back to the beginning. You were, first of all, thanks so much. It was fantastic to hear tonight. And there was 3 parts to accept when to do so. Revealing new information, compromising my usefulness, and when we involve, not to involve third parties. Can you please give me an example of compromising usefulness?
Yes, so very good question. And this is going to be very messy because we're mixing 8 and 9, but it doesn't matter. So don't worry, don't get scientific about this. Well, this is not strictly a step 8 question. If it comes up, let it come. What was the question? Compromising usefulness. Okay, a good example is, let's say you've shoplifted from Marks and Spencer's, which if you're not in the UK is a shop. If you've been shoplifting from Marks and Spencer's, they have a very, very strict policy on prosecuting shoplifters. Now, who is harmed? Very interesting. It ain't the shop, it ain't the specific shop. It is not the staff in the shop. It is not the manager of the shop. They don't care. They don't know. It's covered by something called shrinkage. Your theft is not going to have materially changed the performance of that shop because people are shoplifting from all of them. There's no serious effect there. It's different if it's a little corner shop. That might be slightly different. But the harm to Marks and Spencer's is to the shareholders of Marks and Spencer's. Sometimes people say with these big, oh, I don't owe amends to big corporates. Corporations are evil, so I don't owe amends to them. Yeah, but who owns the corporations? Old people with pension schemes. So people on low incomes sometimes will have shares in pension schemes. So via pension schemes, other investments, they're the owners. They're the people who are suffering because of this. So you owe the shareholders of Marks and Spencer's. You don't owe the person in the shop or the individual store. If you march in and then have to be marched out by the police in handcuffs, that's metaphorical, there probably wouldn't be handcuffs, and you get a criminal record, which means that your job, which requires being able to travel to countries which require you not to have a criminal record, you can't do that job. I know someone who would not have been able to do their job if they had a criminal record. For the sake of what? And what good would that, if you're prosecuted, that's going to cost the company far more than the face value of the goods that you stole, because it will take a lot of people's time to prosecute you. You've got the police, you've got the Crown Prosecution Service. That's the public prosecution service in the UK. The Crown Prosecution Service, the courts, the jurors in the court, if it's a jury trial. You've got prisons, you've got the probation service, you've got the public purse, which has to pay for your benefits because you can no longer get a job because you now have a nasty criminal record. There are lots of ways in which making amends, I know people who've gone to prison because they made amends. And afterwards, I can think of one in particular who is very doubtful as to whether this did any good at all. And I would tend to agree with him on that. So now there's someone who I don't think is Jason, but has his hand up as Jason.
Hello, I'm Samuel, sexaholic. I would like to ask about the one exact wrong. Yeah, I make fun from lots of people, and for example from their clothes and so on. And I want to ask how I should know, or is it like harm and should I do amend in every single case in which I make fun of someone, or maybe how can I know where can I do amend, like from the individual responses, or maybe if you can tell me.
Yeah, super question. Very, very good question. And this is a very common situation. So making fun of people would be one example. Gossip is another, where something will happen hundreds of times, if not thousands of times. Now, the step 8 might look like this. Column 1, making fun of people's appearance, clothing, all of the other things. And then you list all the people that you can think of, 30 people, 50 people, 70 people. But the fact is, when you cut down the step 8 must be complete. You must have a clear and full picture of what you've done and how it affects people. And then you can speculate how that behavior might have affected people. And that's complete. When you get to step 9, in audit, in the area of audit, I don't know, I imagine not many of you are auditors. So when auditors go into a company to assess whether their financial statements, their accounts present a true and fair picture of their real finances, they apply something called a materiality threshold, which means if they're auditing a big company and they discover that there's a small mistake of £500 somewhere, there is a materiality threshold, which means they're not going to adjust the accounts for anything under, say, 10,000, or if it's a very big company, 100,000. They'll report internally to say, we found this, we found that, but they'll only make adjustments over a certain level, which might be 0.5% of turnover or 1% of turnover or something like that. And it's like that with 8 and 9, that you make amends only where the event is material. There's nothing more irritating in recovery. No, there are lots of things more irritating. One of the fairly irritating things in recovery is those annoying people that go around apologizing for everything that no one else is apologizing for, as if to say, look at me with my wonderful moral standards, which only I am living up to. And those amends are an attack on everyone else for not making amends to them. Because what it does, it's such a contrast to what everyone else is doing. It makes it seem that everyone else is morally inept for not making amends in such a way as well. So in other words, let's say it's making fun of people. An awful lot of wrong behavior falls below the materiality threshold. In other words, the person probably was barely affected, if at all. If they were affected, they would have forgotten 5 minutes later or 10 minutes later. There's a phrase in English, the rough and tumble of life. In other words, it's just like with buses. No bus ever follows its timetable exactly, but over a certain point, or with planes as well, no plane ever takes off at exactly the time it's supposed to. But if it's more than let's say 2 hours late, 3 hours late, 5 hours late, various measures start to kick in. You'll get an email from the airline apologizing. You get vouchers for food. You get compensation if it's after a certain. So one's got to use one's judgment here. Let's say it's making fun of people. At boarding school, everyone makes fun of everyone all of the time. But there are going to be certain incidents which cause real upset or real harm. So I made a list of those situations at school where I caused real upset and real harm that was going to be remembered by people. And there were a lot of them, and I made amends for those. So you don't make amends to everyone for everything, because it's below, there are certain things which are below the level, where to do so would be a manifestation of spiritual pride and conceit. I'm so important that this tiny thing that I said 5 years ago is going to have been rattling around inside your brain like a nut for the last 5 years. And I have to go in there and remove this thing which has been irritating you for 5 years. It's rare that people are that important, but I'll give a counterexample. I made amends to a friend of mine from years ago. I knew him 30 years ago very well. And for about 5 years, we went out and went for coffee and non-alcoholic drinks after work, and I would see him regularly. And then he moved countries, and we barely stayed in touch, but there are little messages here and there. At one point, I remembered something I'd done, which I thought was very major, and I made amends for it, and it did need making amends for. And I said, is there anything else? He said, yes, just one thing. And he recalled a comment that I'd made, which I thought was hysterical, and everyone else thought was hysterical. And he'd laughed at the time, but he'd remembered that, and he'd been very hurt by it. And with hurt and harm, the truth is in the eye of the recipient. If it's wrong and they were hurt, an amend is owed. If they were hurt, but it wasn't wrong, that might have been a tactical mistake, but it certainly doesn't necessarily mean an amend. But frankly, most things that one says or does which are wrong are forgotten within minutes or hours or days or weeks. Now, this doesn't mean there isn't a lot of work to do. There'll probably still be hundreds of items. Just one little thing to make sure that the step 8 is complete. I've got a little list here. Again, it's on the blog in one of the PDFs on step 8. There's a little meditation I do after 8 and 9, where I look at, have I missed anything? Is there anything else? And the categories of behavior are these. So gossip and bad mouthing, and this making fun of people would be part of that. Bullying, meanness, cruelty, indifference, ganging up on people, damage to property, theft and borrowing without returning, however small the item in question, inappropriate or material financial gain, milking the system, mistreatment of animals, damage to the environment, and nuisance through drunkenness or other acting out, including noise. And if you go through that list, you'll probably multiply by 5 the number of people being examined. Now, they can be examined in groups. So if there's one piece of behavior with 47 examples, you don't need to write out the same thing again. You just add all the names at the bottom. And there are lots of other examples in the document as well. One more question here, then I'm going to have to go, unless there's anything very brief and very quickly answerable. You mentioned an example of someone putting away the chairs at a meeting because the other person who said they'd do it hadn't done it. You mentioned the harm was interference or nuisance. Just wondering who did harm to who. Yeah, so if you say you're going to do something and someone else, and it needs to be done and you don't, and someone has to step in to do it, it's the person who is being inconvenienced by this. You've given them work that they didn't, that wasn't theirs to do. And it's interesting. I think where you're coming from is, you know, if you do someone's service, have you harmed them by doing the service? This wasn't an AA service situation. But there are times I've had this in AA groups where someone doesn't do the job they're supposed to do. I remember someone who was supposed to sweep the floor, and he sort of stood with a broom but didn't really know what to do with the broom. So, and you tried to sort of suggest to him, do you want to just give it a little sweep? And then he'd start talking to people, and it had to be done for him, because we needed to go. We wanted to go and have our dinner. So you've got to judge each situation separately. There's no single rule for everything. And one thing, I'll finish on this. One little thing with sponsees. The step 8 is their job. I can't tell you how often I've heard a step 8. I do everything writing now with step 8. I get people to present it in writing so I can really think about it. It really forces the truth out when it's in writing. I remember once I was talking to someone for about 40 minutes about a step 8, and it seemed so complicated. And they finally revealed a single piece of information which changed the entire picture and rendered the previous 40 minutes a complete waste of time, because the situation was not what it appeared to be at all. So if you're sponsoring Susie or Bobby, Susie is responsible for doing a proper job. Bobby is responsible for doing a proper job. You as a sponsor, you can guide them, but you cannot do it for them. They have to take responsibility themselves, and that's between them and their higher power. So I think I'm going to wrap up on that, Jason. So do you have any announcements, or shall I close us out?